morning on New Haven started like any other morning, with the twin suns rising over the golden fields and casting long shadows across the settlement domes. Children were already awake and running through the corridors of the main habitat, laughing as they chased each other before school started. Captain Daniel Cross was 3 systems away aboard the civilian transport, vessel Morningstar, when everything changed. Forever. He was reviewing supply manifests in his quarters when the emergency channel crackled to life with a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The voice was small and frightened, belonging to a young girl who couldn't have been older than 10 years old. She spoke in whispers, saying that ships had appeared in the sky and that fire was falling from above, and that her teacher told them to hide, but the walls were shaking and people were screaming. Then there was a horrible sound like tearing metal, and the transmission cut to static. Daniel's hands moved before his mind fully processed what he had heard. He sprinted to the bridge, shouting orders to his crew to change course immediately and push the engines beyond their safety limits. His first officer, Karen Hughes, was already at her station, pulling up the navigation charts and calculating the fastest route to New Haven. The crew worked in focused silence as the Morningstar turned hard and accelerated, with its engines screaming in protest. They were too far away, and everyone on the bridge knew it, but nobody said it out loud. The journey would take 18 hours at maximum speed, and whatever was happening on New Haven was happening right now. Daniel stood at the main viewport, watching the stars streak past and feeling utterly helpless. Karen tried to raise New Haven on every available channel, but received only silence in return. The orbital station didn't respond, and neither did any of the colony's communication arrays. Hours crawled by like days, and the crew took turns monitoring the sensors, hoping for any sign of what had happened. Some of them had family on New Haven, including Karen, whose sister taught at the primary school. Nobody spoke about their fears, but the tension on the bridge was thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel kept replaying that little girl's voice, in his mind, wondering if she had survived and knowing deep down that she probably hadn't. When the Morningstar finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel, at the edge of the New Haven system, the sensors immediately painted a picture of devastation. The orbital station was gone, reduced to a field of debris that sparkled in the light of the twin suns. Emergency beacons were firing automatically from the wreckage, but there were no life signs. Daniel's throat tightened as he ordered the ship to proceed to the planet at full speed. New Haven appeared on the view screen, and what should have been a beautiful blue and green world was marked by dozens of impact sites still glowing red from orbital bombardment. The agricultural domes that housed the 15,000 colonists were shattered and burning. The fields that had been golden that morning were now black with ash. Karen made a sound that was half gasp and half sob as she stared at the screen. Daniel assembled a rescue team within minutes, and they descended to the surface in 3 shuttles. The moment the landing ramp opened, they were hit by the smell of smoke and something worse that none of them wanted to identify. The main settlement was in ruins, with buildings collapsed and streets torn apart by weapons fire. They split up to search for survivors, calling out and scanning with their equipment, but finding nothing. The silence was the worst part of it all. A colony of 15,000 people should have been full of noise and life, but now there was only the wind blowing through broken structures and the occasional creak of settling debris. Daniel's team moved through the residential sector, finding homes that had been occupied just hours before, with meals still on tables and toys scattered on floors. But no people and no bodies either, which seemed strange until they reached the central plaza. The Zarn Empire had gathered the colonists there. Daniel's team found them huddled together in groups as if they had been herded like animals before the attack came from above. The captain had seen combat before and had witnessed death in various forms, but nothing had prepared him for this. These weren't soldiers or armed militants, but farmers and teachers and engineers, and children, so many children. Karen found the primary school on the eastern edge of the settlement and called for Daniel over the radio. Her voice was breaking as she spoke, and he knew before he arrived what he would find. The classroom had been built as a shelter during emergencies, with reinforced walls and a heavy door that was now blown inward. Inside, 20 children sat in a circle with their teacher, Claire Santos, at the center. She had tried to shield them with her own body in their final moments. Daniel Cross had served in the merchant fleet for 20 years and had maintained his composure through countless emergencies and dangerous situations. But this broke something inside him. He fell to his knees beside the children and wept. His crew members stood around him in shock and grief understanding that they were looking at something that would change humanity forever. The team spent the next 6 hours documenting everything they found and searching desperately for any survivors, but there were none. All 15,000 colonists were dead, including 8,000 children who had never known Earth and had been born among the stars. The attack had been systematic and thorough, leaving no one alive to tell the story except for that one little girl who had managed to send a final message before and as they prepared to leave the surface, Daniel discovered a data recorder near the colony's main communication array. The device had automatically captured transmissions from the attacking fleet, and what he found on it made his blood run cold. The Zarn Empire had broadcast their attack across multiple channels, announcing to the galaxy that this was a demonstration of their power and a warning to humanity. The message was clear in its brutality, stating that humans had expanded into territories the Empire considered theirs and that this colony was the price of that transgression. The recording showed Zarn warships descending from orbit and targeting the settlement with precision weapons. There had been no warning and no chance to surrender or evacuate. The attack was meant to kill and terrorize, and it had succeeded in the killing part. But as Daniel watched the footage and listened to the Zarn commander's cold voice explaining that humanity needed to learn its place in the galaxy, he felt something else rising inside him alongside the grief. The Morning Star departed New Haven carrying the evidence of what had happened and transmitting it ahead to Earth. The crew was silent during the journey back, each person lost in their own thoughts and struggling to process what they had witnessed. Daniel sat in his quarters staring at the star charts and thinking about the children in that classroom, and the teacher who had tried to save them, and the little girl whose voice would echo in his nightmares forever. By the time they reached Earth, the government had already received the Zarn Empire's official message demanding that humanity withdraw from 12 colony worlds and pay tribute in resources and accept imperial oversight of all future expansion. The alternative, according to the message, was more attacks like New Haven, until humanity learned to obey. The Zarn expected a response within 30 days, and they expected that response to be surrender. But the Zarn Empire had made a critical error in their calculations. They had studied humanity's history and seen a species that valued peace and negotiation, and had assumed that meant weakness. They had killed human children expecting their parents to bend the knee in fear. They did not understand that humanity had spent thousands of years learning to be peaceful, precisely because they knew what they were capable of when pushed too far. New Haven wasn't going to make humanity surrender, but it was going to show the galaxy something that humans had tried very hard to leave behind in their violent past. The Zarn Empire was about to meet the other side of humanity, and that meeting would reshape the balance of power across the stars. The Earth Assembly Chamber was filled with voices that day, and none of them were calm. Representatives from every human colony and territory had gathered in the massive hall, demanding action and justice and revenge for what had happened on New Haven. Admiral Greg Martinez stood at the central podium waiting for the room to quiet down so he could begin his briefing. He was 53 years old with gray hair and steady hands, and he had spent his entire adult life working toward peaceful coexistence with alien species. Greg had believed that diplomacy could solve any problem and that violence was always the last resort to be avoided at all costs. He had negotiated treaties with 6 different alien civilizations and had helped establish trade routes that benefited everyone involved. His reputation across the galaxy was that of a reasonable man who listened before speaking and who sought compromise over conflict. New Haven had changed something fundamental in him, and everyone who knew him could see it in his eyes. The chamber finally fell silent, and Greg began speaking in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. He described what Captain Daniel Cross and his crew had found on New Haven, and he showed the images that nobody wanted to see, but everyone needed to witness. The representative stared at the screens showing the broken domes and the burned fields and the classroom, where 20 children had died with their teacher. Some people wept openly while others sat in stunned silence. When the images finished, Greg played the recording that Daniel had recovered from the colony's communication array. The Zarn commander's voice filled the chamber, explaining coldly that New Haven was a demonstration of imperial power, and that humanity would withdraw from disputed territories or face complete annihilation. The commander spoke about humans as if they were insects to be crushed, and he laughed while describing how efficiently his forces had eliminated the colony. The chamber erupted in anger after the recording ended, with representatives shouting over each other and demanding immediate military action. Greg raised his hand for silence and explained that the Zarn Empire had sent an official ambassador to present their demands formally. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened and Sethrak entered, flanked by his guards. The Zarn ambassador was nearly 8 feet tall, with scales that shimmered green and gold. Under the lights and eyes that showed no trace of empathy or concern, Sethrak walked to the speaker's platform with the confident stride of someone who represented the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. He looked around the chamber with barely concealed contempt and began reading from a data tablet in his clawed hands. The Zarn Empire demanded that humanity abandon 12 colony worlds immediately and pay tribute of rare minerals and manufacturing capacity equal to 30% of human industrial output. Furthermore, all future human expansion would require Imperial approval, and Zarn observers would be stationed on Earth to ensure compliance. The alternative, according to Sethrak, was simple and final. The Empire would systematically destroy every human colony one by one, until Earth itself stood alone and defenseless. He reminded the assembly that the Zarn Empire had conquered 47 star systems over 3 centuries, and had crushed dozens of species who had refused to submit. Humanity was young and weak, and their only rational choice was to accept the terms being offered. Resistance would only lead to more dead children. Representative Helen Price stood up slowly from her seat in the front row. She was 72 years old and had served in the assembly for 20 years, and her granddaughter Emma had died on New Haven at age 9. Helen's voice was steady despite the tears running down her face as she addressed Sethrak directly. She asked him a simple question about whether the Zarn Empire truly believed that murdering human children would make humanity surrender. Sethrak turned to face her with an expression that might have been amusement on his alien features. He replied that humans were a young species who needed to learn their place in the galactic order. Compassion was weakness according to Zarn philosophy, and weakness would not be tolerated in an empire built on strength and discipline. The deaths on New Haven were regrettable, but necessary to teach humanity a lesson about the consequences of defying imperial authority. Helen listened to his answer and then asked another question about whether Sethrak had children of his own. The ambassador paused, clearly not expecting this line of inquiry, and admitted that he had 3 offspring back on the Zarn homeworld. Helen nodded slowly and asked if he would feel the same way about necessary lessons if someone killed his children to teach him about consequences. Sethrak's expression hardened, and he stated that such a thing would never happen because the Empire was too powerful to challenge. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as Helen sat back down. Greg Martinez watched the exchange with an expression that revealed nothing, but his aide Lieutenant Sophie Barnes had served under him for 8 years, and she knew him well enough to recognize the change. She saw the exact moment when the admiral who had dedicated his life to peace made a different choice. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly and his hands gripped the podium edge just a bit harder, and she knew that something irreversible had just happened. Greg asked the assembly to vote on the Zarn Empire's demands. The voting process was swift and unanimous, with every single representative rejecting the terms. Greg then called for a second vote on whether humanity would defend its colonies with military force. Again, the vote was unanimous in favor. Sethrak watched the proceedings with growing irritation and reminded the assembly that they were making a fatal mistake. The Zarn Empire had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than humanity, and this defiance would only lead to extinction. Representative Helen Price stood again and addressed Sethrak one final time. She told him that he had fundamentally misunderstood what he was dealing with. The Zarn Empire had studied humanity's recent history of expansion and cooperation, and assumed that meant humans were peaceful by nature. But human history stretched back thousands of years before they reached the stars, and those thousands of years were filled with warfare and violence and survival against impossible odds. Humans had learned to be peaceful because they knew exactly what they were, capable of when pushed too far. Sethrak dismissed her words with a wave of his clawed hand and stated that ancient history meant nothing against modern military might. He gathered his guards and prepared to leave the chamber, confident that humanity would reconsider Once they saw Zarn fleets approaching their worlds. As he walked toward the exit, he failed to notice the change in the humans around him. They no longer looked afraid or uncertain. They looked at him with cold calculation, like predators watching prey. Greg Martinez left the assembly chamber immediately after Sethrak's departure and headed directly to the military command center deep beneath the government complex. Sophie Barnes followed him along with the other senior officers who had been waiting for the vote results. The command center was a massive room filled with holographic displays showing the positions of every human ship and installation. Across known space, Greg stood at the central console and accessed the command authority codes that only he and a handful of other admirals possessed. He typed in a sequence that triggered alerts on every military vessel and armed station in human territory. The message was brief, containing only 3 words followed by a longer authorization code. Protocol reckoning was not something that existed in any official military documentation, and most officers had never heard of it. But those who knew understood exactly what it meant. Sophie watched as confirmation signals started appearing on the displays showing that commanders across human space were acknowledging the order. She had heard rumors about protocol reckoning during her academy training, but had always assumed it was just a dark joke among instructors. The protocol supposedly removed all restrictions on human military operations, including rules of engagement and limitations on weapons deployment and strategic targeting. It was meant to be used only if humanity faced genuine extinction. Greg turned to face the assembled officers, and his expression was grim but determined. He explained that the Zarn Empire had made a critical error by targeting civilians and especially children. Every human commander would now have complete tactical freedom to respond as they saw fit, with only one limitation, which was to avoid civilian casualties on their side. Military targets, infrastructure, and industrial capacity were all valid, and the objective was not to defeat the Zarn Empire but to dismantle it completely. The officers received their orders in stunned silence as they realized what Greg was authorizing. Humanity had built weapons and tactics over the past century that they had never revealed to the galaxy, because they hoped never to need them. Ships that could move faster than any alien race knew was possible. Weapons that combined human ingenuity with physics in ways that seemed impossible. Intelligence networks that had been quietly watching and listening to every major power for decades. All of it had been kept secret as insurance against the day when peace failed. Commander Henry Tucker received his orders aboard the strike carrier Vengeance stationed near the frontier. He read the authorization codes 3 times to make sure he understood correctly, and then called his senior staff together. Henry was known as a cautious officer, who always followed regulations precisely, but now those regulations were gone. He looked at the tactical maps showing Zarn industrial systems and began planning strikes. That would have been unthinkable just days ago. Colonel Lisa Monroe got her orders while conducting training, exercises with her battle group near the core worlds. She had spent 5 years developing asymmetric warfare tactics that Command had always rejected as too aggressive. Now those same tactics were not just approved but encouraged. Lisa smiled grimly as she reviewed her target list and started calculating approach vectors. Admiral Patricia Wells commanded the home fleet protecting Earth and the inner colonies. Her orders were different from the others because her target was not military infrastructure, but psychological impact. Patricia had studied Zarn culture extensively and understood that the Empire respected only strength and feared only consequences. She began planning an operation that would strike at the very heart of Zarn territory. Back in the command center, Greg Martinez stood looking at the holographic display of known space, with all the Zarn systems marked in red. Sophie Barnes approached him quietly and asked if he truly believed this was the right choice. Greg turned to her, and his expression was no longer that of a diplomat or peacekeeper. He told her that the Zarn Empire had killed 8,000 human children and expected their parents to submit out of fear. But fear worked both ways, and it was time the Empire learned what humans were capable of when someone hurt their young. The orders went out across human space, reaching every ship and every commander and every soldier who had sworn to protect humanity. Protocol reckoning was now active, and the Zarn Empire had 30 days before their deadline expired. But humanity was not going to wait 30 days. The response was going to begin immediately, and it was going to be unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Zarn wanted to teach humanity a lesson. about power, but they were about to receive an education in consequences that would echo across the stars for generations to come. Commander Henry Tucker sat in the command chair of the strike carrier, Vengeance, studying the tactical display that showed the Zarn industrial moon of Krathvor hanging in space like a ripe fruit waiting to be picked. His battle group consisted of 12 vessels that the Zarn would classify as light cruisers based on their size and apparent armament. What the Zarn did not know was that human ship classifications were deliberately misleading and that each of these vessels carried enough firepower to level a continent. Henry had spent 2 weeks positioning his forces in the outer system using the asteroid field as cover, while his intelligence team monitored Zarn communications and mapped every installation on Krathvor. The moon was home to 3 million Zarn civilians who worked in the massive factories that produced warship components and weapon systems for the Empire. It was also defended by an orbital defense platform and a small garrison fleet of 15 warships that the Zarn considered more than adequate for protecting an industrial target. The plan was simple in concept, but required perfect timing and execution. Henry's ships would emerge from faster-than-light travel at 3 different points around the moon and immediately begin broadcasting evacuation warnings on all frequencies. The civilians would have exactly 1 hour to reach the underground shelters that every Zarn installation maintained for emergencies. After that hour expired, the bombardment would begin and would not stop until every military and industrial target on the moon was destroyed. Henry gave the order, and the Vengeance, along with its sister ships, jumped into Zarn space, appearing simultaneously around Krathvor in a maneuver that should have been impossible according to what the galaxy knew about human navigation capabilities. The Zarn garrison fleet immediately went to alert status and began moving to intercept, while the defense platform powered up its weapons. Henry ignored them completely and opened a channel to the moon's surface. His message was broadcast in the Zarn language and repeated on every communication frequency. All civilians were ordered to evacuate to emergency shelters immediately. They had 1 hour before military operations would commence. Any Zarn military personnel were instructed to lay down their weapons and join the civilians in the shelters, or leave the moon entirely. There would be no negotiations and no extensions. The countdown began at exactly 60 minutes. The Zarn garrison commander named Vector responded with outrage, demanding to know how humans dared to enter Imperial space and threaten Zarn citizens. Henry's reply was cold and factual. New Haven had been a civilian colony with no military presence and no defensive capabilities. 8,000 human children had died there without warning or mercy. Krathvor was a military-industrial complex, and its workers were being given a chance that the colonists never received. The countdown continued. Vector ordered his fleet to attack, and the 15 Zarn warships accelerated toward the human vessels with their weapons charging. The Zarn expected a conventional engagement with ships exchanging fire at range, while maneuvering for position. What they got instead was a demonstration of human engineering that had been hidden for decades. The Vengeance and its companions moved with impossible speed and agility, twisting through space in patterns that should have torn them apart from the G-forces alone. Human weapons fire was precise and devastating. Each shot was calculated to disable rather than destroy targeting engines and power systems and command decks with surgical accuracy. Within 8 minutes, all 15 Zarn warships were drifting in space with their crews trapped inside and life support running on emergency power. Henry had not destroyed a single vessel because he wanted the crews alive to witness what came next and to carry the message back to their empire. The defense platform proved more challenging because it was designed to withstand sustained bombardment and had redundant systems that kept it operational even after taking heavy damage. Henry detached 3 ships from his battle group to deal with the platform while the rest maintained position around the moon. The platform's commander fought bravely and managed to score several hits on human shields before the combined fire from 3 vessels finally overwhelmed its defenses and reduced it to debris. On the surface of Krathvor, panic had spread through the civilian population as the reality of the situation became clear. The factories shut down and workers streamed toward the underground shelters that could hold the entire population in the event of attack. Some Zarn military officers tried to organize a defense, but most recognized the futility and joined the evacuation. The hour counted down with ruthless precision. and Henry watched the sensor readings that showed the movement of people into the hardened shelters. At exactly 60 minutes, the last civilians disappeared underground, and Henry gave the order to commence bombardment. The human ships opened fire with weapons that the Zarn had never seen before. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to a fraction of light speed, struck the moon's surface with the force of nuclear weapons. Energy beams that could cut through meters of reinforced steel swept across factory complexes. Missile swarms that could adjust their trajectories mid-flight hunted down every military installation and weapons depot. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes, and when it ended, Krathvor's surface was transformed. Every factory was gone, reduced to molten craters. Every shipyard was destroyed along with the partially completed warships they contained. Every military installation and ammunition depot and fuel storage facility was erased from existence. The underground shelters remained intact, because Henry's weapons were precise enough to avoid them, but everything else that contributed to the Zarn war machine was eliminated. Henry broadcast a final message to the survivors in the shelters telling them they were free to emerge, and that human forces would not target them again. He explained that Krathvor had been destroyed not out of cruelty, but as payment for New Haven. The Zarn Empire had killed human children, and this was the consequence. The message ended with a warning that every military and industrial target in Zarn space was now considered valid, and that attacks would continue until the Empire surrendered unconditionally. Colonel Lisa Monroe was executing a similar Operation 3 systems away at the Vexlar fuel depot, which supplied the Empire's fleets across an entire sector. Her approach was different because the depot was heavily defended by the Zarn Third Fleet, consisting of 40 warships and considered one of the Empire's premier military formations. The Zarn commander, Admiral Thexnor, was confident that no human force could challenge such overwhelming numbers. Lisa's battle group numbered only 8 ships, but she had spent years studying Zarn tactical doctrine and had identified its fundamental weakness. The Zarn fought in rigid formations with predetermined responses to various threats. They relied on numerical superiority and overwhelming firepower rather than flexibility and adaptation. Human forces had no such limitations, and Lisa planned to exploit that advantage ruthlessly. Her ships jumped into the system not near the depot, but near a small mining station on the opposite side of the system. The Third Fleet immediately moved to intercept, assuming the humans were trying to capture a weak target. Lisa let them commit to the pursuit, and then her ships performed a maneuver that should have been impossible. They jumped back into faster-than-light travel, after only minutes of normal space operations, something that required navigation computers far more advanced than anything the Zarn possessed. The human ships reappeared near the now undefended fuel depot and began their attack. The depot's automated defenses activated but were quickly overwhelmed by coordinated fire from Lisa's vessels. Massive fuel tanks began exploding in chain reactions that lit up the system like a newborn star. Admiral Thexnor realized he had been deceived and ordered his fleet to return at maximum speed, but they were too far away to intervene. By the time the Third Fleet arrived, back at the depot, it was completely destroyed, with years' worth of fuel reserves burning in space. Lisa's ships were waiting for them, arranged in a defensive formation that invited attack. Thexnor fell into the trap and ordered a frontal assault with his 40 ships overwhelming the 8 human vessels through sheer numbers. The Zarn warships charged forward with weapons blazing, confident in their victory. The human ships did not retreat or maneuver defensively. Instead, they accelerated directly toward the Zarn formation at speeds that seemed suicidal. At the last possible moment before collision, the human vessels split apart in 8 different directions, cutting through the Zarn formation like knives through cloth. The maneuver happened so fast that the Zarn targeting systems could not adjust, and most of their weapons fire hit their own ships as the humans passed through their lines. Lisa's vessels emerged on the far side of the formation and immediately began targeting the Zarn command ships. Her weapons were calibrated to disable rather than destroy, but the effect was devastating. Command decks were hit with precision fire that killed senior officers while leaving the rest of the crew alive. Within minutes, the Third Fleet had lost its entire command structure, and the remaining ships were in chaos, with junior officers trying to coordinate without clear orders or leadership. The battle continued for 2 hours, with the human ships methodically crippling the Zarn vessels one by one. Lisa made sure that life support remained intact on every ship she disabled, because she wanted survivors to carry the story of their defeat back to the Empire. When the engagement finally ended, 38 of the 40 Zarn warships were drifting helplessly in space, and the remaining 2 were fleeing the system at maximum speed. Carrying news of the disaster, Lisa broadcast a message to the crippled Third Fleet explaining that they had been defeated not because humans were more numerous or better equipped, but because they had underestimated their opponent. The Zarn Empire had assumed that humanity's desire for peace meant weakness in war. That assumption had cost them one of their finest fleets and one of their most important supply depots. The message ended with the same warning Henry had given, that all Zarn military assets were now valid targets, and that attacks would continue until the Empire surrendered. Admiral Patricia Wells commanded the most audacious operation of all from her flagship Defiant. Her target was not an industrial complex or a supply depot, but Zarn Prime itself, the throne world of the Empire, and home to 8 billion Zarn citizens. Patricia had no intention of attacking the planet, because killing civilians was not part of protocol reckoning, despite the lack of restrictions. Instead, she planned to do something that would hurt the Empire far more than any bombardment. Her fleet consisted of 25 vessels, and they emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Zarn Prime system, broadcasting their identification on all channels. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with every defense platform and orbital station going to maximum alert, and 3 full defensive fleets moving to intercept. The Zarn Emperor himself sent a transmission, demanding to know how humans dared to approach the sacred homeworld. Patricia's response was broadcast across every frequency, so that everyone in the system could hear it. She stated that human forces had no interest in harming Zarn civilians and would not attack the planet itself. However, every military installation and orbital platform around Zarn Prime was now considered a valid target. The defensive fleets were given 1 hour to withdraw to the far side of the system, or they would be engaged and destroyed. After that, her forces would systematically dismantle every military asset in orbit around the homeworld. The Zarn Emperor refused to order a withdrawal because doing so would show weakness before his entire population. The defensive fleets moved to attack, and Patricia's forces engaged them with the same tactical superiority that Henry and Lisa had demonstrated. The battle raged for 6 hours and ended with all 3 Zarn defensive fleets crippled or destroyed. Patricia then turned her attention to the orbital installations and began the methodical work of reducing them to debris, while carefully avoiding any targets that could result in collateral damage to the planet below. When the operation concluded, Zarn Prime hung naked in space without any orbital defenses for the first time in 3 centuries. Patricia broadcast her final message directly to the Emperor, explaining that humanity had tried peace and friendship, but the Empire had responded by murdering children. The galaxy would now learn what humans were capable of when someone hurt their young, and the lessons would continue until the Zarn Empire was dismantled completely. The war that the Zarn Empire thought would last years was over in 3 months, and the galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity dismantled a civilization that had stood unchallenged for 3 centuries. Every major Zarn military installation was destroyed or captured, and every industrial complex that produced weapons or warships was reduced to rubble. The Empire's vast fleet, that had numbered over 3,000 warships, at the start of the conflict was down to less than 200 vessels, and most of those were trapped in their home systems with no fuel to move and no supplies to sustain their crews. Captain Ryan Foster led the ground operations that secured Zarn colonial worlds and ensured that the civilian populations were protected during the transition of power. Ryan was 38 years old and had served in the Marines for 15 years before transferring to the new rapid response units that were created after New Haven. His orders were clear and simple, which was to target only military installations and personnel who had participated in attacks on civilian populations. Anyone who surrendered would be treated fairly, but anyone who continued to fight would face the full force of human military power. The first world Ryan's forces landed on was Talvik, which had been a major Zarn military training center and garrison world. The planetary governor was a general named Kreshitar, who had built his reputation on brutal suppression of resistance movements in conquered territories. Intelligence reports indicated that Kreshitar had personally ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners during his career and had celebrated the attack on New Haven as a necessary demonstration of imperial strength. Ryan's landing force consisted of 5,000 troops equipped with armor and weapons that represented decades of human military development, kept hidden from the galaxy. They descended to the surface in dropships that moved too fast for the Zarn ground defenses to track effectively, and established a perimeter around the main military complex within an hour. Ryan broadcast the standard message offering surrender to all Zarn military personnel, and promising fair treatment for those who laid down their weapons. Kreshtar's response was defiant and angry. He declared that no Zarn warrior would surrender to humans, and that his garrison of 20,000 troops would fight to the last soldier. Ryan listened to the transmission and felt no anger, only a cold determination to finish what had been started. He gave the order to commence the assault, and his forces moved forward with precision that came from years of training and preparation. The battle for the military complex lasted 6 hours and demonstrated the vast difference between human and Zarn ground combat capabilities. The Zarn fought bravely, but their tactics were centuries old, and their equipment was designed for suppressing lightly armed resistance fighters rather than facing a peer military force. Human soldiers moved through the complex in coordinated teams using advanced sensors to locate enemy positions and neutralizing them with minimal collateral damage. Kreshtar was captured, alive in his command bunker along with his senior staff. The general demanded to be executed immediately, claiming that death was preferable to the dishonor of surrender. Ryan informed him that he would not be granted that mercy because there were questions he needed to answer about his involvement in war crimes. The general was transported to a human ship in orbit where he would await trial along with others who had targeted civilians during the Empire's expansion. Similar operations played out across dozens of Zarn worlds, with human forces securing military targets while allowing civilian government to continue functioning under observation. Lieutenant Amy Shaw, who served as a communications specialist on Ryan's command staff, spent most of her time explaining to confused Zarn civilians that humans were not there to conquer or occupy, but to ensure that the military leadership responsible for atrocities faced justice. Many Zarn found this concept difficult to understand because the Empire's own history was built on subjugation and exploitation of conquered peoples. The Zarn military tried every tactic they could think of to slow the human advance. They attempted to use civilians as shields, but human sensors could distinguish between armed combatants and unarmed citizens with perfect accuracy. They tried to destroy their own infrastructure before human forces could capture it, but demolition teams were intercepted before they could complete their missions. They even sent assassination squads to Earth hoping to decapitate human leadership, but those teams were captured before they ever reached their targets. Admiral Greg Martinez revealed during a press conference that human intelligence services had been tracking Zarn spy networks for years and had deliberately left them in place to feed false information back to the Empire. Every Zarn agent on Earth and the colonies had been under surveillance, and when they received orders to attack human leadership, they were arrested within hours. The revelation shocked many people who had not realized how extensively humanity had been preparing for the possibility of conflict. The Zarn Empire attempted to forge alliances with other species, hoping to create a coalition that could resist the human onslaught. Diplomatic missions were sent to the Valorian Collective and the Kickstar Assembly, and the Krenth warlords, offering trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. Every offer was politely refused because humanity had spent decades building relationships across the galaxy based on fair trade and genuine cooperation. The goodwill that humans had accumulated paid dividends as species after species declined to intervene on behalf of an empire that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. Commander Stephen Blake led the final major military operation of the war at Zarthek Station, which served as the Empire's last major military stronghold. The station was commanded by General Krathnor, who had personally led the attack on New Haven and had ordered the bombardment of the children's shelters after the initial strike. Intelligence reports indicated that Krathnor viewed the New Haven operation as his greatest achievement and had requested permission to lead similar attacks on other human colonies. Stephen's assault on Zarthek Station was designed to capture it intact along with its commander and senior staff. The station's defenses were formidable, with hundreds of weapons platforms and a garrison of 50,000 troops. But Stephen had advantages that made those numbers irrelevant. His forces used a combination of electronic warfare to disable sensors and surgical strikes to eliminate key defensive positions before launching the main assault. The battle for control of the station lasted 3 days, with human forces methodically clearing sections and securing prisoners. Crathnor tried to destroy the station's reactor rather than allow it to fall into human hands, but the demolition charges were detected and disabled by human engineers. The general was captured in the command center, surrounded by the bodies of officers who had chosen to fight to the death rather than surrender. Stephen had Crathnor placed in a holding cell that had been specially prepared with a single screen on the wall. The screen played footage on a continuous loop, showing the attack on New Haven from multiple angles, including ground-level recordings that showed the moments before the children died. Crathnor was forced to watch the consequences of his orders over and over while he waited to be transported to Earth for trial. The general demanded to be treated as a prisoner of war, citing galactic conventions that protected military personnel from cruel punishment. Stephen's response was delivered in person as he stood outside the cell, looking at the Zarn officer who had killed 8,000 human children. He explained that Crathnor had violated every principle of honorable warfare when he targeted civilians, and that he would face justice for those crimes. The footage would continue playing until Crathnor understood exactly what he had done and why humanity would never forgive or forget. With the fall of Zarthek Station, the Zarn Empire's military resistance collapsed completely. Scattered forces continued to fight in remote systems, but they were isolated and unsupplied, and most surrendered within weeks. The Zarn Emperor, who had ruled from his palace on Zarn Prime with absolute authority for 40 years, found himself with no fleet to command and no armies to defend his throne. His advisors urged him to negotiate a conditional surrender that would preserve some measure of imperial dignity, but humanity had made clear that only unconditional capitulation would be accepted. The Emperor delayed as long as possible, hoping that the galactic community would intervene or that human resolve would weaken with time. Neither happened, and as human forces secured the last Zarn military assets, the Emperor finally accepted that his choices were limited to surrender or invasion of the homeworld itself. He chose surrender and sent a message to Admiral Greg Martinez requesting terms for a formal capitulation. Greg's response was brief and non-negotiable. The Emperor would come aboard the human flagship Valiant in orbit around Zarn Prime and would sign the Articles of Dissolution, which would break the Empire into independent systems under galactic oversight. All military forces would be disbanded, and all weapons of mass destruction would be turned over to human custody. War criminals, including those responsible for the New Haven attack, would stand trial. There would be no negotiations and no modifications to the terms. The Zarn Emperor arrived aboard the Valiant 3 days later, accompanied by his advisors and guards. He was a massive individual, even by Zarn standards, standing nearly 9 feet tall with scales that had faded from bright gold to dull bronze with age. Greg greeted him with military courtesy but no warmth and led him to the conference room where the Articles of Dissolution waited to be signed. The Emperor read through the document slowly, and his expression grew darker with each paragraph. He looked up at Greg and asked a question that had been bothering him since the first human attacks. He wanted to know why humanity had hidden such devastating military capabilities and allowed the galaxy to believe they were weak. Greg's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. He explained that humanity had not hidden their capabilities, but had simply chosen not to use them. Humans valued peace and cooperation, and had genuinely hoped to build a future where force was unnecessary. The weapons and tactics that had destroyed the Zarn Empire had existed for decades, but remained unused because humans understood the horror of war better than most species. The Empire's mistake was assuming that the choice for peace meant inability to wage war. The Emperor placed his mark on the Articles of Dissolution with a trembling hand, and the Zarn Empire officially ceased to exist. The 47 systems that had been under Imperial control would each govern themselves with oversight from a galactic council to ensure fair treatment of all citizens. Zarn military assets would be destroyed or converted to peaceful purposes, and the species would be prohibited from building offensive weapons for at least 50 years. The Emperor prepared to return to the surface. Greg stopped him with one final message. He told the Emperor that humanity had learned a terrible lesson about what they were capable of when pushed to the edge. The galaxy would never again underestimate human resolve or human capacity for violence. But Greg also warned that humanity would ensure no species ever again suffered what New Haven experienced. The Empire had created something they did not intend, which was a human military force committed to protecting not just their own but all innocent lives across the galaxy. The Emperor departed without responding, and Greg watched from the viewport as the shuttle descended toward Zarn Prime. The war was over, but the work of building peace from the ashes of the Empire had only just begun. The galaxy had learned that humans could fight and win, but now they would learn whether humans could also help their defeated enemies rebuild, and whether mercy could follow vengeance. Greg hoped the answer would be yes, because the alternative was becoming the very thing they had just destroyed 6 months after the destruction of New Haven. A memorial was constructed in orbit around the dead colony where 15,000 souls had been murdered by the Zarn Empire. The structure was simple and elegant, consisting of a ring of polished metal that caught the light of the twin suns and reflected it back toward the ruined settlement below. Every name of every person who had died was inscribed on the inner surface of the ring, and the children's names were written in letters, large enough to be seen from the surface. Captain Daniel Cross attended the dedication ceremony, along with thousands of others who had lost family and friends in the attack. He stood at the viewport of the transport ship that had brought him to New Haven and looked down at the colony that he had found in ruins 6 months ago. The images from that day were burned into his memory, and he knew they would never fade no matter how much time passed. The little girl's voice on the emergency transmission still haunted his dreams, and he wondered if he would ever find peace. The memorial service was conducted by Representative Helen Price, whose granddaughter Emma had died in the primary school classroom with 19 other children. Helen spoke about loss and grief and the impossibility of moving forward when part of your heart had been torn away. She also spoke about justice and the responsibility that came with power. Humanity had proven that they could wage war with devastating effectiveness, but now they faced a harder challenge, which was to build something better from the ashes of that war. The dedication ceremony concluded with a moment of silence that lasted exactly 8 minutes to represent the 8,000 children who had died. Daniel stood with his head bowed and felt the weight of what had happened settle over him again. When the silence ended, he placed a small flower at the base of the memorial marker and returned to his ship. He had a new assignment now, working with the reconstruction efforts in former Zarn territory, but he would carry New Haven with him forever. The galaxy had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted 6 months earlier. Humanity's reputation had transformed overnight from eager newcomers to the most feared military power in known space. Other species approached human diplomats with a mixture of respect and caution, understanding that the peaceful facade had concealed capabilities that exceeded anything they possessed. Ambassador Ruth Morgan worked 16-hour days trying to reassure the galactic community that humanity sought peace, but she was honest about the new reality. Ruth explained at every diplomatic meeting that humanity would never again allow anyone to harm their children or their civilians. The consequences would be absolute and final. She made clear that this protection extended to allied species as well, creating a network of mutual defense that slowly began to reshape galactic politics. Species that had been terrorized by larger powers for centuries suddenly had a powerful friend willing to stand beside them. The balance of power that had existed for so long was broken, and something new was being built in its place. The former Zarn territories struggled to adapt to their newfound independence after centuries of imperial rule. Some systems flourished immediately, grateful to be free from the Empire's exploitation and eager to build their own futures. Others descended into chaos as various factions fought for control, and old grievances erupted into violence. Humanity provided aid and peacekeeping forces where requested, but refused to impose solutions or take control of systems that wanted to govern themselves. Commander Henry Tucker, who had led the attack on Krathvor, was promoted to admiral and given command of the peacekeeping operations across the former empire. His approach was firm but fair, enforcing basic rules about civilian protection and democratic governance, while allowing each system to develop its own path. Henry spent most of his time traveling between systems, mediating disputes, and occasionally using force to stop atrocities when diplomatic solutions failed. On the former military world of Talvik, where Captain Ryan Foster had captured, General Kreshtar, the transition to civilian government was proceeding slowly but steadily. The new planetary council consisted of Zarn civilians who had never held power under the Empire, and they struggled with basic questions about how to govern without military oversight. Human advisors worked with the council, teaching them about democratic principles and helping establish institutions that would protect individual rights. Lieutenant Amy Shaw served as the primary liaison between human forces and the Talvek Council, and she found the work both rewarding and frustrating. The Zarn civilians had lived their entire lives under authoritarian rule, and concepts like free speech and fair trials seemed strange and impractical to them. Amy spent hours explaining why these principles mattered, and why humanity considered them worth fighting for. Progress was slow, but it was happening, and she could see attitudes changing week by week. The war crimes trials began on Earth 3 months after the Empire's surrender, and they were broadcast across the galaxy so that everyone could witness justice being carried out. General Krathnor, who had ordered the attack on New Haven, was the first to stand trial, facing charges of crimes against sentient beings and deliberate targeting of civilian populations. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including his own communications ordering the bombardment of the children's shelters. Krathnor showed no remorse during the trial, claiming that he had simply followed the Empire's military doctrine and that his actions were necessary to maintain imperial authority. The prosecution presented recordings of the attack and testimony from survivors of other Zarn atrocities, showing a pattern of deliberate cruelty that went beyond military necessity. The jury, consisting of representatives from multiple species, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The sentence was life imprisonment on a secure facility built specifically to hold Zarn war criminals. Krathnor would spend the rest of his life watching footage of New Haven and the other colonies he had destroyed, forced to confront the consequences of his choices. Some people argued that execution would be more merciful, but humanity had decided that death was too quick and that these criminals needed to live with what they had done. At the Earth Assembly, Representative Helen Price proposed new legislation that became known as the New Haven Doctrine. The doctrine stated clearly that any species anywhere in the galaxy that deliberately targeted human children or civilians would face the full military might of humanity with no restrictions, and no mercy and no negotiations. The vote was unanimous, and similar protections were extended to allied species, creating a framework of mutual defense that changed how the galaxy thought about warfare. Admiral Greg Martinez retired from active military command and accepted a position as humanity's chief diplomatic envoy, tasked with ensuring that the galaxy understood both sides of human nature. He traveled from world to world, meeting with leaders and building relationships that would hopefully prevent future conflicts. At every meeting, Greg carried a small holographic projector that displayed images of New Haven before the attack, showing the children who had died and the peaceful life they had lived. Greg's method was unusual but effective, because he wanted everyone to understand what had been lost and what had been unleashed by that loss. He explained that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their tactics, but their absolute refusal to accept the death of innocence as the cost of peace. The images of the children, playing and learning and dreaming, served as both a memorial and a warning about what would happen to anyone who threatened the innocent. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes, who had served as Greg's aide during the war, accompanied him on these diplomatic missions and watched as he transformed humanity's image from conquerors to protectors. She noticed that leaders who met with Greg came away with a deeper understanding of human motivations and a healthy respect for human capabilities. The combination of compassion and strength was something the galaxy had rarely seen, and it was changing how species interacted with each other. On the anniversary of New Haven's destruction, Daniel Cross returned to the memorial for the second time. He had made a private vow to himself that he would visit every year for the rest of his life and read every name aloud so that the dead would never be forgotten. The reading took 7 hours and his voice grew hoarse, but he continued until the last name was spoken. When he finished, he looked up at the stars and made a promise to the children who had died. He promised that humanity would remember why they had fought and what they had lost. The galaxy had learned that humans would protect their children with overwhelming force, but Daniel vowed that humanity would also remember to protect everyone's children, not just their own. The Zarn Empire had wanted to teach humanity their place in the galaxy, and they had succeeded in a way they never intended. Humanity's place was as guardians standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. The former Zarn Emperor lived in exile on a remote world under constant supervision, stripped of all power and authority. He spent his days writing memoirs that nobody would ever read, trying to justify decisions that had destroyed his empire and killed millions. In his writings, he blamed humanity for being deceptive and hiding their capabilities, but he never accepted responsibility for starting a war by murdering children. The galaxy continued to change as the months passed and the new order established itself. Trade routes expanded and new alliances formed based on mutual respect rather than fear. Species that had been enemies for centuries began talking to each other with humanity, serving as mediators. The destruction of the Zarn Empire had created a power vacuum, but it had also created an opportunity to build something better than what had existed before. Admiral Patricia Wells, who had struck at Zarn Prime, now commanded humanity's exploration fleet searching for new worlds and new civilizations beyond known space. Her mission was to expand human knowledge while avoiding the mistakes that had led to conflict with the Zarn. Every first contact protocol was designed to establish peaceful relations and to make clear that humanity valued cooperation over domination. Captain Ryan Foster continued his work on Talvek and other former Zarn worlds, helping them transition to self-governance. He saw progress in unexpected places as Zarn civilians who had lived under tyranny began to embrace concepts like individual rights and democratic representation. The work was slow and sometimes frustrating, but Ryan believed it was the most important task humanity had ever undertaken because it proved that victory in war meant nothing without justice in peace. The children of New Haven were gone, but their memory lived on in everything humanity did. Every diplomatic mission and every peacekeeping operation and every act of compassion toward former enemies was done in their honor. The galaxy had learned that humans would fight to protect their young, but humanity had also committed to ensuring that no other species would ever experience what New Haven had suffered. The other side of humanity that the Zarn Empire had met in those 3 months of war was not cruelty or bloodlust, but the unleashed fury of a species that loved so deeply they would burn down empires to protect those they cherished. That fury had been channeled into building a better galaxy, where strength was used to defend the weak rather than exploit them. The children who died on New Haven would never know what their sacrifice had created, but their names would be remembered. As long as humanity reached for the stars, and their legacy would be a galaxy where children could grow up safe under any sun.